हाय एवरीवन। आज मैंने रघुराम राजन का एक इंटरव्यू पढ़ा इंडियन एक्सप्रेस में। तो आई वुड लाइक टू कमेंट माय थॉट्स ऑन दैट। फॉर एग्जांपल, द हेडलाइन ऑफ दैट आर्टिकल वाज कि इफ इट इज बिजनेस एज यूजुअल, विकसित भारत बाय 2047 विल नॉट हैपन। पहले इंटरव्यूअर ने उनसे पूछा कि फ्रॉम पीपल्स पर्सपेक्टिव ओवरऑल अफोर्डेबिलिटी कुड become worse despite the inflation rate coming down. Some academics argue inflation targeting is not suited for India. Others, even within the government, suggest ignoring food inflation. What is your take? तो उन्होंने बोला कि I think the reason that we are targeted headline inflation rather than core inflation is because food is such a big part of India's consumption basket. To ignore it is to ignore one of the biggest components of inflation. You may say, as RBI says, core inflation is coming down, but if your food inflation is high, people are hurting, and they are saying, "Ki what world are you living in? You don't even see the fact that we are hurting." तो फिर उन्होंने पूछा कि गवर्नमेंट क्या कर सकती है? What can the government do or could have done to contain inflation? So no, he was also shocked that is the real challenge that we have, right? That if you look at our GDP level relative to what it would be, if we had grown at 6% steady through the pandemic, we are about 6% below 1 year of growth, and that's a lot of that 1 year means lot of jobs lost. But also, what is important in our economy itself is not creating enough jobs. मतलब मैन्युफैक्चरिंग फॉर एग्जांपल इज बिकमिंग मच मोर कैपिटल इंटेंसिव ओवर टाइम। तो कंपनीज फैक्ट्रीज बनाने में ही ज़्यादा कैपिटल लग रहा है, और कंस्ट्रक्शन में हम जॉब्स बना रहे हैं, लेकिन एग्रीकल्चर अभी भी वरीसम है। Why are people going back to agriculture when in fact in every developing country they should be coming out of into the services and manufacturing? Services was creating jobs, but through the pandemic it has not. I think the big question for the government has to be, how do we create more jobs and higher quality jobs? Just before COVID hit, India's growth rate was less than 4%, and there was secular deceleration that was happening over the 3 years preceding COVID. Why did we see the massive jump for the straight years? Well, recoveries are not immediate, right? So remember, there are few quarters of really negative growth, strongly negative growth during the pandemic. So the sort of spring back recovery has boosted over the 2 and 3 years. Now I thought, what where you were going is our real rate of growth the 4% or 6%? The 4% growth rate would be terrible if we go back to that. My hope is that we may have another quarter of low growth, but we go back eventually to 6. But even with 6, it's not enough. फिर इंटरव्यूअर ने पूछा कि फॉर एन इकोनॉमी लाइक इंडिया where even a 4% GDP growth looks like stagnant economy, and while it is not exactly stagflation at present, is India facing something similar to stagflationary scenario? Oh, 4% is deep recession from our perspective. I think we go down to 4, 4 से भी नीचे जाएं, we are in terrible situation. Remember, we are in sweet spot of every Asian economy was when it got population dividend, a lot of young population coming into the labor force and reducing dependency rate. So our working age population as a fraction of the population is growing. That is when our growth should, even relative to the recent past, go up by a percentage point or two if we create jobs for the people coming into the workforce. The fact that we are not growing faster now is really worrisome, right? In other words, I keep saying 6% won't cut it, but it should be more than 6% just from the population dividend. It should be even more for us to achieve goal of Viksit Desh by 2047. If it's business as usual, it's not going to happen. How do you see trend of all political parties promising government dole? Does it mean Indian politicians have given up on solving unemployment? Well, I think there's competitive political process to give out doles. Some transfers are not bad if they are targeted at the poor because that gives some ability. But if you give out so much in dole, you cannot make infrastructure investments, that you cannot invest in public provision of service, better schools, better healthcare. For example, rural roads नहीं बना सकते. The problem right now is some of our state governments are spending so much on this, there's not enough to invest in really improving the capabilities of our population. And ultimately, we will live or die on the basis of how much we invest in our people. Today, manufacturing cannot really, if it's globally competitive, cannot employ unskilled workers. It uses machines. What it needs is workers who take care of machines. That requires a level of skills too. Similar services may be SI. Many leaders are now urging Indians to have more children, either to boost economic growth or political reasons. How do you view these calls? So the reality is that in some states the fertility rate has fallen below the replacement rate. The reality is that we are a country with very mixed sort of economic experience. The north isn't doing as well as the west and the south in terms of per capita income. What would be nice if instead we encourage more migration? Because truly, when do countries stay young even when they grow rich? A country like US, because a lot of immigration has taken place in our country, we can have more internal migration, which takes care of the problem. Should India cut GST rates to boost consumer demand? If you constantly cut and raise GST rates, then people don't have an ability to plan. And then you have the whole lot of lobbying, cut my rate, keep this rate high, etc. I would say keep working on normalizing the GST rates over time, but offer some predictability. So this was the interview of Raghuram Rajan, which I liked. Thank you for listening.